Well, it seems like my prediction has come true. Unicorn Overlord has sold the most on Nintendo Switch. Nintendo Switch carried this game into relevancy, and this doesn't surprise me at all because of its similarities with Fire Emblem and like the fact that it's a Japanese game and the fact that nobody owns a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox. And Nintendo Switch dominated with Unicorn Overlord, and I think this officially clinches it. Like the era of third-party games doing better on PlayStation is effectively over. And right now we're kind of seeing like the denial period from the industry, right? You're seeing a lot of people like make excuses about Final Fantasy Rebirth bombing, right? They're trying to say things like, "Oh, the PS4 had a way bigger install base." Well, why isn't that install base buying a PS5 to play the new game, right? They don't want to acknowledge the very real drop off that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has had over Remake, right? People did not like the bait and switch, and they will not continue to support it. It doesn't matter how many titties you shove in their face, like they aren't going to stick with this mediocre game forever. If anything, it feels like most people never even finished Remake is my genuine take on it. Like Angry Joe's reaction to Rebirth is a really good example of how I think like the typical fan went through Remake, right? Oh, it's the greatest game ever. Oh, I love Final Fantasy VII. And when the sequel comes out, like it's impossible to stay invested, right? Because all of the problems with Remake start piling up. And even now, seeing people like talk about how ridiculous Rebirth is, like I think there's some like debate on whether Eris dies or not, which is just retarded. Like the fact that like we were even having this conversation it at all goes to show you just how out of touch Square Enix was. Like that was back in the day was seen as like the absolute worst thing they could possibly have done is like not kill off Eris, and yet now because it's ambiguous, it's okay. Like, oh, it's debatable. Oh, it'll keep people talking. But no, the reality is nobody is talking about this because nobody cares. The Final Fantasy brand has stagnated because of their refusal to acknowledge that over the past 20 years, their audience has become almost entirely Nintendo centric. And it is entirely because of Nintendo's very smart business decisions. Investing in RPGs, creating their own iconic RPG brands, focusing on getting ports of the old classic Final Fantasy games, on Game Boy Advance and other platforms, getting being involved with localizing Dragon Quest games. I remember when people like Sean Malmstrom would criticize Nintendo for focusing so much on Dragon Quest, like, oh, it's Dragon Quest, it'll never take off in America, like it'll never be popular here. It's not as good as Final Fantasy, but the reality is, Dragon Quest is becoming more popular in the West as hardcore fans of the genre begin to understand its legacy and uh, its history. Right? The reality is, Dragon Quest, in my opinion, is better than Final Fantasy because it has maintained its relevancy longer. Right? Like it's kind of crazy how I've been getting into Dragon Quest, and I've been kind of baffled by just how many like high quality Dragon Quest games are. Like you have the mainline games. I've played 7, 8, 4, 11. I've played Builders. I played Monsters 3. I've started Builders 2, right? I probably would be playing more Builders 2 if I wasn't so burned out from Builders 1. But like, I I'm looking at all these games and I'm just like, yeah, Dragon Quest has become one of my favorite video game IPs ever. And a big reason I even knew what it was because, I saw Nintendo Power promoting the Dragon Quest remakes back in the day. They were focusing a lot on 5 and they showed off the artwork. I love the idea of having a wife and like your family being in the party with you, like that was super appealing to me at the time, and I really wanted to go out and buy Dragon Quest V specifically, but oops, it's a niche release, you can't find it, never picked it up. Was never able to find a copy, but years later I finally played the game, and I really enjoy it, right? So so like, yeah, like this idea that people have that like Final Fantasy was going to always like be dominant on PlayStation platforms, it's not true. Like PlayStation has thrown all of its weight behind PlayStation over the past several years, and it's slowly been eroding over the past several decades. And the same is true for like Capcom and Konami and everything else, right? Monster Hunter Rise did not sell significantly worse than World did, even though it was obviously supposed to be a budget release, right? Like it's weird seeing like the developers freak out about this because I know like there are a lot of shills who want to convince you that Rise was somehow worse than World. It wasn't, and are trying to convince you that like World is like soaring in popularity while Rise has like dropped off to promote Monster Hunter Wilds, right? Um, it's going to be the same result, honestly. Like these companies cannot coast off of like the occasional AAA like major entry in their most famous franchises on PlayStation and Xbox anymore, right? The reality is like gamers have evolved to the point where we can actually pick out like niche games and recommend them to other people, right? Something like Unicorn Overlord seems to be doing better than Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And a big reason for that is because Unicorn Overlord actually had the brilliant idea of seeing a release on the most popular platform on the market right now. Right? That's really all that's what this boils down to. Like companies really tried back in like the 2000s like convincing you that like the reason they weren't supporting Nintendo products was because like oh the PS2 is way more popular. They're way better for us. But like, you certainly didn't see them come out for the Nintendo DS, right? You didn't see them come out for the Wii. You didn't see them coming out for the Switch even, right? Like they always had this mindset that like they always had this narrative that like the PlayStation was more popular than the other consoles, but the reality is quite different. The reality is people are migrating away from PlayStation. They are discovering other studios that are producing better RPG franchises. Persona is bigger than Final Fantasy right now. I'm sure that like Shin Megami Tensei is going to keep growing bigger because it's consistently been on Nintendo hardware, right? We're seeing like people start to appreciate Zelda more and Mario more and Fire Emblem more and like like it's these other companies that have like hinged all of their bets on like supporting PlayStation and trying to drive Nintendo out of the console industry, they failed, honestly. Like that's what I think every time I see these kind of this kind of damage control. It's like every single time they come out and try to convince us that Nintendo has failed. Nintendo has failed. Oh, the sky is falling, but it just hasn't happened, right? Even now, like we're seeing this, like Princess Peach Showtime and Unicorn Overlord are doing phenomenally well, but the narrative has always been that they bombed, even though that like Princess Peach Showtime specifically has outsold Rise of the Ronin and Dragon's Dogma 2, right? Both of those games were extremely disappointing to the mass audiences, but are you seeing people acknowledge that? Like at the very least, I could have. I can tell you 100%. I would have bought Rise of the Ronin if it launched as a Nintendo Switch game. Like it didn't even have to be an exclusive. It just had to release on my preferred platform. But nope, we're gonna release it on PlayStation. So nope, you're not gonna see my money. Right? I'll wait for the Nintendo version. That's the mindset that I think a lot of people are having right now. I did this with Dragon Quest XI, one of the best RPGs I've played in recent years. Like I just waited for the Nintendo version, right? They tried doing this thing where they had a major blitz campaign for Dragon Quest XI on PlayStation 4. They tried selling that version to Japanese audiences over the more popular 3DS version in Japan. And then when it came here, they deliberately tried not releasing the 3DS version at all. They tried promoting the PS4 version and people bought it. It was like fairly successful, but it didn't become really popular until the superior Switch version, right? Because Nintendo invested in the company, and because Nintendo fans associate Dragon Quest with Nintendo hardware, even after everything they tried to do to make the series more popular on PlayStation. Right. Remember when they bundled in Dragon Quest 8 with like Final Fantasy 12 or whatever, right? Like that was everything they tried to do to make PlayStation more popular than Nintendo has fallen flat on its face. Is essentially what we're seeing here. And now we are at this weird point where we are going to continue seeing Switch succeed over the other consoles for quite a long period of time. right? Like the narrative has always been that like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X would outperform Nintendo consoles eventually, but like I really don't think that's the case. Like I think there's going to be one big spike of interest when Grand Theft Auto 6 launches and everybody plays that for a bit, but like I do think there's going to be like this big like awakening moment where people realize that like Rockstar games are not that good. They aren't that well executed. They aren't that fun to play. They lag behind their competitors, right? What innovation is there will there be in Grand Theft Auto 6 compared to 5, right? Like it's gonna be the same thing as it's always been since San Andreas, only worse, right? Like I think people are really vastly underestimating just how much of a letdown Grand Theft Auto 6 is actually gonna be. And if we have to wait another decade for a new one, like it's very possible that like the PlayStation brand will never recover, right? If we have to wait another 10 years, 12 years, right, for Grand Theft Auto 7, like it's 100% going to release on Nintendo hardware. Like they can't keep doing this. They can't keep tricking people into thinking that like Nintendo is can't run these games because that was the crazy thing that we heard at the beginning of the generation, right? Like, oh, Nintendo can't run Near Automata, it can't run Persona 5, it can't run any of these games, right? And yet, like, they all came out, on the console, even though they really should have launched like day one. Like Near Automata and Persona 5 specifically should have been like a day one release, right? They should have been like major Switch launch titles, but nope, they decided to like shaft Switch owners for no reason. So with that in mind, with that being said, um, times are changing for sure. This is a major milestone moment, I think. I'm beginning to see more and more people like acknowledge the reality that the rest of the industry can't compete with Nintendo. I'm seeing more and more people like address the reality of the situation. I'm seeing more and more people like point out the fact that like Nintendo is winning the console war. I'm seeing more and more people like acknowledge that like Nintendo games are just better. And I'm seeing really weird situations that people aren't really pointing out at all. Like Endless Ocean Luminous, like it's outselling Stellar Blade on Amazon Japan right now. A game that everyone said would flop is outperforming one of the most highly anticipated PS5 titles ever. Right? Like I don't think people like understand what a big deal that is. And going into May, going into the next couple of months, where we get like Luigi's Mansion 2, which is going to be hugely popular and successful, and Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which I anticipate to be the best-selling Mario RPG ever made. Like I don't think like we'll ever be in a position where Nintendo will struggle ever again, right? Because the traditional narrative of there being like a nothing to play on Nintendo consoles is just floundering near constantly. Third parties can't hold back their releases anymore, right? They can't stagger their releases. They can't like focus on other hardware because if they do that, they run a risk of being ignored by Nintendo audiences, right? Like I do think that like if they keep playing these stupid games, they are going to become irrelevant. Like Vanillaware is a really interesting studio in this regard because I remember when Muramasa came out and they tried to blame the game's failure on it being a Nintendo exclusive. And they committed to producing more and more like PlayStation exclusives, culminating in 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, which bombed on PlayStation 4 and was only saved by the Nintendo Switch version, right? So again, this was a studio that was committed to like serving their Sony overlords, like just slurping up all of its semen, like trying to like stay relevant on PlayStation hardware. But in the end, they're uh, they're right back to where they started, where they belong on Nintendo hardware. And I hope very soon that every other developer follows their path.